Thank you all for coming today. Our guest is Dr. Erik Lenert from the Institute for State Politics in Germany. Dr. Lenert was born in East Berlin, studied at Humboldt University in Berlin, and he studied philosophy and history. His PhD thesis was on Karl Jaspers and political anthropology. He's author of several books. Most important, a book on Gerhard Nebel. And also he published a dictionary of state politics together with Dr. Karl-Heinz Weissmann. He is a redactor, as first of all secretary at the Institute for State Politics, and he is also redactor in publishing house Antaios and chief editor of Secession magazine. So that's about him, and Dr. Lenert, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Dear Dusan, dear sir, madam, thank you for the invitation and of course for the friendly introduction by Dusan. I would first like to thank you for being here in Serbia and Belgrad. It's my first time ever in Belgrad and Serbia, so it's something very special for me. My English is not the best, so I apologize that I'm giving the talk as a lecture. The title of the lecture is East and West, about the Gordian knot of our time, and it's about the debate from the 1950s that I think is extremely current. Expectations were running high when Ernst Jünger first published his essay The Gordian Knot in 1953, because not 2 years ago he had announced his personal withdrawal from the public scene, which was due to the furor that his essay The Forest Passage had roused. So what's the new essay about? Jünger was convinced that he had spotted a major drift in all history, and that this drift had led to the unique encounter of the East and the West in his time. Quote Jünger, "People always feel like they're the first to enter the old stage and meet the old plot." Quote end. But it's nothing less than the old story of the affair between freedom and fate. Jünger, "The ruling of the free spirit is ever again demanding sacrifice." Quote end. Jünger's speech in metaphors and images is outstanding for the reason alone that it is quite extraordinary in his time, when the Second World War was only just over and already the Cold War was approaching its climax. The Korean War, which raged as a proxy war, was only freezed by an armistice in 1953, and insofar the title of the essay, The Gordian Knot, was more than just a reference to the one who was bound to untying it. The knot symbolized the fate, whereas the stroke of the sword was a free decision that would create a new world. The contrast between East and West, Asia and Europe, was not abstract to Jünger, but to be found on maps and therefore changeable and concerning two layers of human existence. There is an infallible knowledge of difference which is to overcome all spatial power relation due to its valuation of freedom. The valuation of free will may of course differ because its application has both advantages and disadvantages. Where the free spirit prevails, many have a say, and decisions have to be negotiated and laboriously manner. Whereas wherever cohesion prevails, the masses can be more easily formed according to one will and consequently can act more powerful upon that will. But it's a free will that underlies the possibility of every free decision, the deed that makes a difference. That's when lone wolves outweigh masses. Jünger thus remains true to what he has experienced. The free decision is the sharpest weapon when the left and the right border are fixed. Ultimately, this is a principle that has governed German military tactics since the 19th century. It had led to a German soldier's superiority, which could only be overcome by the enemy when he has a much larger contingent of men and material at his command. Every approach to the east, Jünger continued, was bound to be determined from the transfer of eastern policies, whether it was Napoleon's or Hitler's turn. In the vastness of the east, time and space would pose a threat to every Western adversary. Jünger's quote: "As a rule, it can be assumed that a European strategist loses his advantage when he is talking options which isolate him and allow the time to pass slowly." Quote end. In other words, at some point the initiative gets stuck because it's lacking a specific goal and the overstretched supply lines inhibit any movement at all. Jünger does not ask what happens if the East indeed would advance further westwards than the river Elbe, although this could well have happened when he wrote this essay. Instead, Jünger's conclusion remains a Solomonic one. The struggle between East and West will remain undecided because it takes place in every human being. Both East and West have shaped the moral character of man. Quote Jünger: "The encounter remains a constant problem, a constant task." Quote end. But despite all the philosophical interpretation, Jünger finally returns to the situation of the world. The East and the West are beginning to share the world, the East under hegemony of Russia, the West under that of America. And Jünger refers to the determinism that follows from the constellation, which inevitably sees an apocalypse following the here, due to the confrontation of two nuclear powers. Jünger contradicts because he is convinced question of power cannot be calculated, the substance of which the world miraculously sustains itself is incalculable. What was in 1953 to make of such an interpretation? The book had reprinted twice within 6 months due to the many enthusiastic reviews. But the reader was left with the impression that this was Jünger's farewell to politics. An impression was even reinforced that few years later, when the next essay, The World State, was published in 1960. In that essay, Jünger marks the confrontation of the political blocs are something ostensible that may sidetrack one from the, Jünger quote, great and growing uniformity that spreads over the countries, quote end. Consequently, Carl Schmitt, as a friend of clear distinction, would examine these views in a rather critical way. Ernst Jünger and Carl Schmitt had known each other since the late 1920s and had taken very different paths in the Third Reich. from which their positions concerning the defeated and divided Germany were derived. Ernst Jünger, the author of Marble Cliffs, who wrote in 1933 in a state described as an inner emigration, had withdrawn and was now, after a publication ban in the immediate post-war years, celebrated again in the feuilletons, whereas Carl Schmitt, whose reputation was linked to his essay "The Führer Protects the Law", Der Führer schützt das Recht, which he wrote in 1934, has had engaged himself with this regime and now preferred to conduct conversations in the security of silence. A phrase that Schmitt took from Andrich, as I learned yesterday from Dujan. The personal relationship between the two authors did not remain unaffected. Tensions built up but still remained unspoken of. Therefore, it was not difficult for Armin Mohler, the former secretary of Jünger and admirer of Carl Schmitt, to persuade Schmitt to contribute to a publication on the occasion of Ernst Jünger's 60th birthday, which was to be published in 1955. Carl Schmitt provided comments on the essay "The Gordon Note" under the headline "The Historical Structure of Today's World Conflict Between East and West." To this publication, and these comments went into another direction as Jünger's essay. In fact, the difference was so great that Schmitt ended with a warning. He did not want his point of view to be misread. It would be directed against Jünger's figurative thinking in antithetical states, and pointed out that it would be unfair to reduce Jünger's views to some formulas instead of testing the impetus of his quintessence. But this rather benignant conclusion sharply contrasted Schmitt's own thesis that he had developed in his essay. Starting with the characteristics that have shown themselves in the conflict between East and West over the course of history, Schmitt focuses on the more important contrast, namely the contrast of land and sea. Like Jünger, he does not understand this as a polarity, but as a specific dialectic that refers to the question-answer structure of all historical situations and events. Dialectics, understood as a strict opposition of question and answer, is contrasted by Carl Schmitt with all ideas of polarity that emanate from mutually dependent quantities. Quote Schmitt, "The polar tension contains a similarity of the opposites that form it as simultaneity that is always present in the structure again and again in the same way. The specific historical picture, on the other hand, contains a dialectic tension, namely the succession of a specific question and an equally specific answer." Quote end. Jüngers as well as can see East and West as components of Europeans' bipolar truth, while Schmitt is referring to the either-or question and answer. In other words, it's politics. Carl Schmitt, however, is not alone in assuming that every historical action is a person's answer to a question posed by history. Schmitt quote, "Every answer derives its meaning from the question to which it answers and remains meaningless to anyone who doesn't know the question." Quote end. He borrowed this constellation from the Anglo-Saxon tradition. The expansion to the dialectic of challenge and behavior is best known by Arnold Toynbee, a British historical philosopher whose 12-volume edition, A Study of History, was published in German as a summary in 1949. But Carl Schmitt was less concerned with the laws that govern history, but with a unique, specific situation. Accordingly, he confronts the other interpretation of the present with his own. The historical epoch of the Industrial Revolution and unleashed technology was a result of the transition to a maritime existence. The latter was the answer to the opening oceans. Quote Schmitt, "For us, today's world dualism is not a polar, but a historical dialectical opposition between land and sea." Quote end. This is Carl Schmitt's answer to Ernst Jünger, that responded to Jünger's call in the sharpest manner and formed the continuation of Schmitt's own short booklet from 1942, Land and Sea, a World Historical Mediation. Coming from the contrast of land treaters and sea formers, Schmitt examines the changing relationship between land and sea, rejecting determinism right from the start because a new sense of space, a space revolution or spatial revolution, would otherwise be unthinkable. But Schmitt is concerned with changing the structure of the concept of space, because the basic political order, the nomos of every epoch, depends on it. The last historical completed space revolution was that of the 60th and 17th century, when European seafarers took possession of the rest of the world, the age of European land seizure, which was supplemented and completed by British seafaring. The latter led to a change into the war waged at sea against trade and those also against civilians to the point of annihilation. With the development of sea in the course of the 19th century, the British lost their status as a sea formers and became, so Carl Schmitt, machine operators. Therefore, Schmitt must be understood: the British could not do anything about the loss of their power in the two world wars and lost the initiative. But this is not the only reason why the British, in his opinion, would have nothing to do with the new spatial planning that is emerging. The fact would be also due to the inherent abolition to the distinction between land and sea. Schmitt saw the ongoing spatial revolution as a complement to the Russian Revolution, the end of the bourgeois society. The replacement of the British in world domination had been already foreseen in 1994 by the British geographer Halford Mackinder. In his essay, The Geographical Pivot of History, Mackinder had formed the thesis that world domination in the future would be given to the one who ruled Eurasia. The British, as a naval power, had long been able to prevent the emergence of a land power, but ultimately fell victim to their own inventions, the steam machine and the locomotive, which enabled the land powers to establish themselves as a countervailing power by opening up the Eurasian continent. Geographically, Mackinder distinguished between the world island, primarily Europe and Africa, the offshore islands, primarily the British and Japanese islands, and the outlying islands, primarily America and Australia. Sorry. The heartland, on the other hand, the Russian Empire, with its western and southern border areas, would be the center of the world island. According to Mackinder, the one who dominates this heartland would consequently rule the whole world. When the two essays by Jünger and Schmidt, which were cited at the beginning, were published in the 1950s, it was the Soviet Union that dominated Eastern Europe, which had been fiercely fought for between 1941 and 1945. But obviously they didn't rule the whole world. On the other hand, it was not without reason that in the 1950s the Soviet Union began to intensify its efforts to gain influence in Afghanistan. One of Mackinder's successors, Ian Morris, an agent of the Big History theory, had recently published a voluminous book that argues that the opposition between land and sea is still relevant. The title of the book, Geography is Destiny, already indicates that without its island position, British history would undoubtedly have taken a different course. But Morris is not a strict determinist. Instead, he understands Great Britain's geographical position to be a challenge to which an appropriate answer had been found. Thus, constitutes in a quite pragmatically way. Morris wrote, "We are neither the slaves of the masters of fate. The secret of our consists in the outstanding which way the cart is moving and figuring out how to get the most out of it." Quote ends. It's the implications of Great Britain's geographical position from which a deeper understanding of the constant British trials to build a counterwall as far as possible on the mainland in order to protect themselves from threats may well accrue. In contrast to Carl Schmitt, Morris sees the maritime age already beginning with the voyage of discovery at the end of the 15th century. Since then, Britain's journey to the center of the earth has begun, so that its position at the geographical periphery has eventually become a central location. The Atlantean economy and the inventions of the Industrial Revolution made Britain rich and, by its self-image, the most virtuous people in the world. Since Morris himself belongs to this people, he does not discuss this typically British double standard any further. Interestingly enough, Morris established a geographical relationship between the Ice Age, which separates the British Isles from the continent, and the so-called Brexit, when Great Britain left an international organization, the European Union. In his opinion, there is also a non-material relationship, because each and every scheme that ever has been a stake in history can be well traced back to identity, mobility, prosperity, security, and sovereignty. This explains not only the Brexit, but also the whole of British history up to that point. Consequently, according to Morris, the Brexit was just the new British answer to the old geographical questions. Why we are talking about old or maybe simply outdated questions, here's easily explained when we come back to Carl Schmitt, for he was not yet finished with his interpretation of the East-West contrast. Rather, he followed up with a warning that consists in the repeated reference to the downright singularity of each historical situation. Quote Schmitt, "By believing that these situations are historical and be holding on to what was true in the past, people forget that a historical truth is true just once." Quote end. Therefore, the question arises as to what is the present current call of history that may be not longer identical with the opening ocean. Unfortunately, however, it is only too natural for people to respond to a new call with an old answer. But it's precisely the continuation of the old truth that becomes unhistorical, for it is therefore all too natural that the victor of the past epoch is most likely to miss the call of history. For how can the victor understand that even the history is true only once? At this point, Carl Schmitt stops without dwelling on speculations about the nature of the new call. However, this thesis and losses may well be real winners with regard to the future is not at all new. Similar debates took place after the First World War, when the conservative revolution was formed in Germany, which was of the opinion that the loser had to be in a better position in future, for everything was bound to change, and one who had just been confirmed by his victory would have to be less prepared to that change than the one who had been forced to question everything by his latest defeat. At any rate, it cannot be said that the victors of the two world wars had the right answers to the most pressing problems. Hans-Dietrich Sander, a German right-wing philosopher, put it sectorally for the Second World War. Quote Sander, "The triumph of the victors was a triumph of the old forces of liberalism and socialism. It did not solve any of central problems, but intensified each one." Quote end. That's due to the fact that allies were the victors only because they had managed 2 times to create an unnatural alliance between them. Thus, their alliance was an unnatural one because their answers to the world's problem could not have been more different, which was ultimately to become apparent in the Cold War. And that was just the situation which Jünger and Schmitt were discussing. The phrase Cold War usually refers to Churchill's Iron Curtain and the Truman Doctrine, according to which the prevention of Soviet expansion had to be paramount. The phrase was introduced to the political debate in 1947 by Walter Lippmann. However, it was first used by George Orwell, who in October 1945 saw the world heading for a permanent state of the Cold War. On the one hand, Orwell was referring the existence of the atomic bomb, which the Russians would soon possess, and resulting monopolization of power in a few great empires, to which Orwell include China in addition to the Soviet Union and the USA. On the other hand, he referred to James Burnham's book, The Managerial Revolution, and in that revolution Orwell saw the socio-political complement. Both the atomic bomb and the rural managers would lead to a new era of slavery, quite as stable as it used to be an ancient world. He saw in it the kind of worldview, the kind of beliefs, and the social structure that would probably prevail in a state that is at the same time invictable and in a permanent state of Cold War with its neighbors. In the 1970s, Ernst Nolte, a famous German historian, wrote an astute book about the Cold War, which contrasted two extreme interpretations. The first interpretation refers to the specific power political conflict between two superpowers that had been deployed on the German border since 1949. The second interpretation places the Cold War in the context of the world civil war of ideologies in a challenge to the Western democracies that has been ongoing since 1917 by alternative ideologies such as communism and temporarily joined by the National Socialism. That's the setting to inquire again after the nature of challenge we are speaking of, the call of history in the mid-1950s. According to the official interpretation, it obviously consisted in bringing Western Europe into unison up to the point where the American hegemon could expect a reasonable return to its security guarantees. What went down in history as a rearmament debate had begun with the war in Korea, because every German could imagine what would happen if the Soviets in Europe acted similarly in view of the constellation to the inner German border. European unification, at first openly directed against Germany militarily, soon spread to the western remnants of this former adversary and led to Germany's admission to the NATO, which the British in particular hoped would accurately weaken the French position. Moreover, according to Nolte, Germany's history is more a history of ideological conflicts and political divisions than the history of any other nation in the world. As a war zone of a specific nature, Germany is far older than the Cold War, which was fought to a large extent on its soil. Marxism was born in Germany and the Second World War started here, wrote Nolte. In this respect, it is not as far-fetched as it may seem at first glance that two of Germany's outstanding minds in this historical situation did not concern themselves with rearmament of European unification at the first place, but instead took their time to question, each in his own way, the background against which this spectacle, visible to all mankind, took place. Today, we are facing a quite similar situation in Germany. In the front, it questions our part in defending Western values and the necessary means to do so. The war in Ukraine has led to a militarization of politics that seemed unthinkable only 10 years ago in Germany. Meanwhile, the development of the party, the Grünen, the Green Party in Germany, from a peace-loving club to a bellicose one, does not miss a certain logic. But the first question has to be, what is happening beneath the surface? What is the historical challenge for us? And to answer this question, we nevertheless need to take a look at Ukraine, but not so much at the specific causes of the war, but to the conflict that represents it. It's ever again about geopolitics. For Russia, this is about crossing a red line. Ukraine's NATO membership would finally push the country into the role of a regional power. The US has an interest in this simply because it is the only way to secure its hegemony over Europe, which is currently already being challenged by the Chinese at the eastern end of Eurasia. Some commentators have therefore compared the Ukraine war to the Korean War, not only in terms of the prospect that there will be no winner in that war either, but also in terms of the outbreak of war. In 1950, Korea came second to the United States, as Europe was a center of gravity. Today, it is the other way around. The US has to concentrate on the Eastern Pacific, a constellation that may not only benefit Putin. A sure indication that is difficult to interpret this situation furthermore is the lack of unity on the part of the European right wings as to which party to the conflict should be supported. On the one hand, there is the Ukrainian people who are defending themselves against the imperial aggressor and cultivating a self-evident nationalism, but at the same time carrying the civil religious dogmas of their allies into the country and subjecting them to the one world ideology. On the other hand, there is Russia, which opposes the unipolar world order, the decadence of the West and its contempt for family, religion and state, while at the same time striving for the denazification of Ukraine. These interpretations are mainly based on rumors and guesswork, as it is difficult to discern what is going on there through the fog of war and the propaganda of both sides. But the cultural conflict between Russia and the West is of course much older than the current war in Ukraine. The German journalist Hauke Ritz already pointed out the cultural dimension of this debate at an early stage. He described a dispute about a modern and a postmodern worldview. According to him, it's ultimately a question of how humanity in the 21st century should deal with the traditions that have arisen in history so far. Should they be transformed, preserved, or cut off? Modernism argued for preservation and integration into the modern world, while postmodernism wants to relativize it in a deconstructive way. Russia has opted for the former, cultivates national identity, recognizes the church as a factor, and places group identity above individual identity. This can be seen as a reaction to the Soviet experience, which was perceived as a brutal top-down modernization. Hauke Ritz demands the recognition of Russia's cultural independence of the West, which would have to realize that its project of unlimited freedom leads to a dead end. Such an insight is naturally difficult for the victor of history, who, moreover, may even to be blind to the corrosive power of liberalism. Following Carl Schmitt, the conflict between modernity and postmodernism can also be grasped in a more specific manner, namely as a dialectic of particularism and universalism, which is still reflected in the dialectic of land, Russia, China, Iran, and sea powers, USA, UK and Japan, and which immediately raises the question of the validity of this division in the minds of every European. Does particularism follow from our status as a land power, or have we finally become a spiritual appendage of the maritime powers by the cultivation of universalism that took place in our country? That's the question. Regardless of how one decides on this issue, particularism and universalism are the main ideas between which the future of the world is decided. As early as 1994, Rolf Peter Sieferle, a German historian, has put this very clearly. Today's defensive universalism stands in total opposition between the interests of the people in the affluent zones and its ultimate goal of planetary humanitarian justice. That's because it follows an abstract principle. National particularism represents specific interest and must perish in an universalistic world. Visionless representation of interest against bottomless ethics of conviction. This may well be the confrontation of the future. Perhaps, at least in the short term, the specific interests have the better cards. But that's only the invitation to develop a greater radicalism in terms of ethics. As we can see, the relationship can be thought of not only as a total opposite, but also as a polarity, like Ernst Jünger. Universalism and particularism are related to each other, are attitudes that are mutually dependent and mutually fueling, and which, without their counterpart, tend to degenerate. Frugal self-limitation becomes narrow-minded self-deification without an idea that points beyond it. As the expansive system idea without a limiting factor becomes missionary bigotry. In this tension, we have to find our place and make the right decisions. Our peoples, we have to show that we are not finished yet, that our existence is still worthwhile, that our way of life still has a perspective. This is our Gordian knot that needs to be untied. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to questions, but I think it's better if Dujan translate my answers. Thank you very much.